We're good. Awesome. So yeah, I suppose we can introduce ourselves quickly. So my name's Sam Shepherd, one half, I suppose, of Total Endurance Nutrition, based up in Cheshire and Liverpool area. And I suppose, yeah, Kit and Kirsty, you've got some questions from your athletes for us today to try and answer, and whether these are common questions. I'm sure they probably are common questions, actually, based on what people's experiences of race season have been this year, and then things to address moving forward, I guess, and also some common questions that might be misconceptions, actually, I would say, based on what you've provided us so far, which hopefully we can try and answer some of those as well. Yeah, Jules, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, not a lot to add really. I'm Jules Strauss, part of Total Endurance Nutrition as well. Yeah, I think you've kind of covered everything in terms of what we're hoping to achieve today. So Kit, Kirsty, do you want to introduce yourselves and then we can get going?
Okay. Yeah. Kit Walker, triathlete and triathlon coach at Total Tri Training. And as the others have said, we've had some interesting questions coming from our athletes, some interesting discussions within our groups about nutrition and what worked and what hasn't worked, and the individualized kind of for each person side of it this year, and wanting to get you guys on board to have a bit of a chat about this and try and help some athletes out with making better decisions around it.
Okay, and I'm Kirsty, the other half of Team KW, also coaching for Total Tri Training. Again, nothing much to add. So we'll fire away with some questions. The first one we've got is this, I'm going to guess, common misconceptions about carb loading. So James would like to know, how early in the week should we be depleting? Do we eat normally in that week? How long before we start carb loading? He's put here, is there any specific amount of protein that we should be sort of eating as well in training? So it's quite a lot all in one question.
Okay, so carb loading, right. I guess historically, and where we understand the idea of carb loading from traditionally, was like, this was back in the 60s. When we did a bout of exercise to deplete muscle glycogen levels, so carbs in the muscle, and then you get this super compensation effect. And so you get maximal stores of glycogen essentially in the 2 or 3 days after that. And that's where the idea of doing like a depleting or a hard bout of exercise came from, and then just stuffing your face with carbs basically, and you get that super compensation, the highest levels of glycogen that you can achieve really. But in the 80s, there was that was sort of challenged a little bit, and naturally as athletes we would taper during the week leading up to an event. So it's not necessary that you need to reduce or do a really hard bout of exercise, but the idea is that you just maintain your mixed diet, and then maybe 2 or 3 days out from the race you would start to increase your carbs, and that would also get you to the same level. And so bringing that right up to date is actually, we know now that you can get to the same levels of muscle glycogen just by doing a carb load over about 24 to 36 hours. So really, you don't need to start that until maybe the night or the evening before, the day before, if that makes sense, the race. So
Friday night for a Sunday race.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So yeah, that'd be starting the process on the Friday night, and then Saturday is really hitting it hard. But one of the key things is not to leave it all to the dinner, for example, on that day before the race. It's almost too late at that point. So we actually say breakfast, mid-morning and lunch are really critical on the day before the race, because it gives your body time to process and then store those carbs in the muscle. Basically. So, I mean, it's quite useful that we now know that from the research and the science, because, you know, we don't necessarily want to do a hard bout of exercise 3 days out from a race. You know, that could have implications for how we do on race day. But also, I think it's a bit easier to get your head around and to plan where you just go, right, I've got to eat a lot for this 24, 36 hour period, and that's going to see me right for the race and prepare me well. But I think for us, it's just about creating a solid plan that you use to achieve that. And for most people, that 24, 36 hour load will work. There will be some exceptions to that because it is a lot of food, and you have to be, you have to practice that, which I'm sure we'll come back to this idea of practicing and how long do you need to practice and stuff like this as we work through the questions. But it's really critical because, if, for example, people that I've worked with before, and you say, right, this is what you need to eat, you list it for them, you show them what it is, and they go, hang on, that's a lot of food to eat. And it does take a bit of practice to get used to it, but it is effective in achieving, high muscle glycogen levels pre-race. I think the second half of that question was about protein, was it, Kirsty? How much protein to eat in general, was it? Or
yeah, and just like, should you eat the normal amount of protein that you would normally eat whilst training? Should there be any amount of depletion? And also, on the topic of depletion, people talk about coming off of caffeine and coffee for so many days before to get that last minute buzz. So maybe that's something else we could add to the question.
Yeah, I'll carry on. So yeah, the protein, so day-to-day training, protein is really important for recovery, but also to support the replenishment of carbohydrate stores in the muscle as well. So it's kind of interacts with the carbs to do that. In terms of the amount of protein, ideally you want between 1.5 grams and 2 grams per kilo of body weight per day. So for example, if I'm 75 kilos, I need to be eating around 150 grams of protein per day. Now, that doesn't mean that you just have it all in one go, or you get it all from shakes or whatever. You need to spread that evenly through the day as well. Yeah. So ideally, if I take 150 grams as my target amount, then I would have 30 grams at breakfast, 30 grams mid-morning, same at lunch, same mid-afternoon, and then the same at dinner, something like that. So you're getting a sort of continuous input of that protein into the body. So it's and that fits with the training, that we're doing, once or twice a day, where you just need to keep supporting your body to recover from each session over time. So they're the two key principles: is the amount, 1.5 to 2 grams per kilo of body weight, and that's the same for men and women. And then small portions through the day to add up to that amount, really. When we come to carb loading, the protein becomes less important because that's just not the priority at that point in time. The priority is the carbs. So that's the only time that we start to think, right, we can reduce the protein and also the fat in the diet as well, to account for, or to allow us to take on more carbs, basically. The other thing is I'll answer there is the caffeine. So I think this is very much personal preference. And this is what I would always say to athletes. Though if I take myself again as an example, I know that I need caffeine on a daily basis, like most people, I would think. And I think withdrawing that caffeine maybe 2 or 3 days out can then start to make you feel, or I know certainly for me, it makes me feel very lethargic, very tired, and you start to get headaches and things like this just because I'm used to a certain amount of caffeine. So for me personally, I wouldn't worry about the caffeine, and you're talking about a small increase in performance on race day if you maybe withdrew it, but you're going to feel crap potentially in the days leading up. But personally, for other people, it might not be an issue if their caffeine intake habitually is fairly low, maybe 1 or 2 cups of coffee a day. Then you might be able to get away with it, and you would see a bit of a benefit come race day, where you start to take on caffeine, particularly towards the back end of a race. I think is when it would really start to make a difference. But I think it's personal preference. And again, going back to we'll keep saying this, practice. It's one of those things that you just need to practice to work it out for you, really, I think.
And do you have on the caffeine subject? So I remember reading somewhere once that they said you can take up to 5 milligrams per kilo of caffeine, which I believe is, so if you take that for someone, so for me who's at 80 kilos, that's 400 milligrams of caffeine. Like, that's quite a lot. So I mean, and I know that, again, this is going to be a very personal thing, but do you have athletes that actually go up to that kind of level of caffeine during an Ironman or an event? Or is that then risky with gastrointestinal issues?
And yes, and that's the real issue, is the GI. And again, practice. If you don't practice this, you will never know whether that is the case. And I think this is the other thing. We always talk about practicing nutrition during, prep sessions, maybe 10 or 12 weeks out, which we'll probably cover from a race. But having the caffeine element of that is another add-on, really. I think really you can only achieve those levels of caffeine intake by using specific, caffeine tablets or something like that, which aren't always easy to digest, aren't always easy to carry, in fact, on the bike or whatever you're doing. It is possible. I'd just say, again, it's personal preference, and you've got to weigh up the risk versus benefit for you personally. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so next question we've got from Luella, who's a female athlete, and she says for her last 2 Ironmans, she's fueled on approximately 60 grams of carb an hour. She was talking to her friend who's coached by someone else, and they say that they suggested to her to have only 40 grams of carb an hour on the run. And she wanted to know whether, this was for menopausal women. This was specifically around menopausal women. And she wanted to know around if that's a thing that for her specifically to have less on the 70.3, or whether she should be taking the same on a 70.3 as she should on an Ironman, and how that relates potentially to everyone or that kind of bracket specifically.
Okay, so I'll jump in on that one. So I think the thing to bear in mind initially with that question is that in terms of the guidelines that we have for carbohydrate feeding during long distance racing, whether that's 70.3 or Ironman, the current guidelines would suggest to have 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour, whether you are male or female. That is in some ways to be caveated, I guess, if that is that word, or to bear in mind that yes, research in females is lacking, and I think we're very aware of that at the moment. However, at the moment, those are the guidelines that we need to work to. So in terms of the guidelines, I think we'd be looking to fuel an athlete at 70.3 and Ironman at 60 to 90 grams an hour, whether they're male or female. And I think bringing in the idea of the menopause and postmenopausal athletes, we also need to remember that postmenopause, women are more reliant on carbohydrate as a fuel source. Pre-menopause, women are better fat burners than men, but post-menopause, women, with the changes in hormones that we get, women become a lot more dependent on carbohydrates than they would have been previously. So when it comes to fueling triathlon in particular, I think it's important to remember it in that way. It is a multi-sport event. It isn't 3 separate events in isolation. And I think when it comes to fueling triathlon, I think most of our athletes find that with practice, they can tolerate more carbs than they thought they could, and also tend to favour fueling more heavily, more aggressively, if you like, on the bike leg. And then traditionally, where people might have more GI issues in the run, if they fueled quite well on the bike, certainly upwards of, ideally up at around 90 grams an hour, but certainly upwards of, 70 to 90 grams an hour with practice, they can then get away with, if you like, kind of fueling a little bit less on the run. And most of our athletes probably target in the kind of 50 to 60 grams per hour region on the run. So yeah, I mean, fueling at the levels that you're describing sound quite low to me. Obviously, everything's individual and it's very dependent on the athlete themselves. But from our perspective, we sort of pride ourselves, and from our research backgrounds, are, you know, very evidence-based in the work that we do. And so for us at the moment, in terms of the evidence to support fueling at certainly at the lower levels that you're describing, the evidence just isn't there to kind of support that guidance at the moment.
And with that fueling, obviously you say it's specific. If someone had a habitually lower carb diet, would you still encourage them to fuel higher carb on race day? Kind of like a train low, race high type thing, or is that a whole different subject?
It's probably a whole different subject, really. And I think in some ways it depends on the athlete themselves, what they want to achieve on race day. You know, are they there to compete or are they there to complete? And there may be some argument in that sense towards maybe, you know, if they are looking to complete a long distance race, then it may be some slightly lower carbohydrate approach, but certainly not a low carbohydrate approach to racing. But, you know, for us, most people we work with, even if they follow a low carbohydrate diet, they would be fueling with, you know, high carbs on race day. And I think with that in mind, I think we also need to bear in mind that a lot of athletes that come to us are, you know, under fueling a lot of their sessions and are, without realizing it, following a lower carbohydrate diet. And most people report when they, you know, start working with us and we introduce in a measured way better carbohydrate intake around their training sessions and things, they report feeling so much better, hitting numbers that they didn't sort of hit before. And that also then starts to fall into place with kind of the higher carbohydrate intake, specifically around training, and this kind of idea of a periodized approach to carbohydrates in terms of providing the body the carbohydrates to fuel the sessions when they're needed and then recover from them appropriately afterwards.
Brilliant.
I'll just jump in. I'd say we're probably actually going to cover this on a separate talk / session with TTT on a Wednesday morning ride in November or something like that, which is partly based on some of the testing we do at LJMU, where we can look at the ability to burn fat, how good that is. And there was a paper from a group in New Zealand, when was this, about 3 or 4 years ago, which is quite an interesting paper, but suggests, you know, your ability to burn fat is quite variable. Some people have a very high ability, some people have a low ability, and that will really determine how many carbs you need to take on during a 70.3 or an Ironman as well. And so yes, those with a high ability to burn fat, and I'm talking very high, someone like, for those that might know him, Dan Plews, you'll have heard of him, Kit. Yeah. He has a very high ability to burn fat, and so his carbohydrate intake during a race can afford to be a little lower. For other people where their fat burning ability is quite low, then you've got to rely on some more carbs. Otherwise, you're just not going to get through it, basically. But yeah, more to come on that, I suppose.
Yeah,
perfect.
Brilliant.
So you've touched on this already, but I'll go with the question as it's written. And again, there's 2 parts. So Amy would like to know, in terms of how much she should be eating on the bike compared to the run, so specifically for her 70.3 racing. So again, she talks about eating the right number of carbs per hour, which you've sort of put a number on, but should this be significantly different between the bike and the run, or is it personal preference? The other thing that she would like to know, so separate question, is any tips on what snacks to eat between meals? She often refers to cereal bars or toast, but any other ideas or inspiration?
Sure. So in terms of the the fueling, obviously we've touched on that already. So 70.3 in Ironman, people are ideally looking in the region of 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour. And again, it's important to kind of think of a multi-sport event, triathlon, as a kind of complete event rather than fueling at that rate in the individual events necessarily. And ultimately for me, the best approach for an athlete comes down to practice and allowing plenty of time for that practice during training. You know, identifying key sessions during the build to kind of practice the best approach. So, you know, in the build to an Ironman or a 70.3, some big brick sessions are ideal to really practice your fueling on the bike and the run. And also thinking about constraints in terms of your bike setup and how you can carry that nutrition. So many people these days train on Zwift often, with a table set up next to them with countless bottles, gels, sweets, bars, you know, you name it, it's there on a table, it's not on their bike or in their pockets. So come race day, or, you know, a few days out, and you kind of try and translate what you've practiced into training into what you can actually carry on race day. That can be a bit of a challenge. So I think that's something that's important to think about when it comes to practicing your nutrition, is also kind of thinking about the logistics on race day, because, you know, it's one thing to practice your nutrition and come up with the perfect plan that works for you. If you can't carry it on race day, you're going to be, you know, you're going to come unstuck. So I think the kind of logistics and the practicalities around that kind of thing are important to consider as well. Sam, did you want to add anything there?
No, I think you hit that.
I think she said in that question as well, sorry, she put, is there an optimum on how often she should be eating on the bike or run? So say you were consuming the same amount of carbohydrate, 80 or 90 grams, is that better as 4 lots of 20, 2 lots of 40, 8 lots of 10, like whatever it may be?
I'd say we don't have, well, there's limited research on this, I would say. What we do know is that it's better to go little and often. Now, how little and how often we don't know entirely, but I would suggest from a logistical perspective, every 15 minutes or so for taking on board some carbohydrate. So yeah, like you say, if we're aiming at 80 grams, and probably 4 times 20 would be absolutely perfect. I think going 8 times 10 becomes a bit of an issue. You know, you're constantly reaching down for some carbs or whatever. You've still got to think about, you want to be in your position riding. From a blood sugar perspective as well, ideally you wouldn't take a big bolus of 40, 50 grams of carbs all in one go, because it'll spike your blood sugar, and then the risk is it comes down. Whereas so little and often, it's just you'll increase it and then it'll just maintain that. Ideally you'll maintain that blood sugar level, so you're on a nice even keel. So that's perfect for 70.3 or Ironman racing, where you just want, you know, you're there all day and you're just keeping your blood sugar at a nice even level, really, and you're not going to have any spikes or crashes in between, really.
Perfect.
Brilliant.
And then snacks between meals was her other part. So cereal bars and toasts, what can you inspire her with?
There's loads of kind of convenient grab and go type snacks out there. You know, in terms of things that are convenient to kind of take to work, or, you know, have just to grab in the fridge, things like cottage cheese are great as a higher protein snack, or Greek yogurt or skyr with some berries, or, you know, with some fruit and maybe some granola if you're looking for a higher carb snack there. I'm trying to think, rice cakes and with some nut butter are a nice option as well. And I'm trying to think of some other ones. Veg sticks and hummus, you know, great for kind of meal prep to have some, you know, veg sticks cut up in the fridge ready to go, and, you know, ideal for that kind of mid-afternoon slump, often when it might be easier to reach for, I don't know, a slightly higher sugar snack, for instance, if you've got these things prepared and ready to grab, it makes them a lot more likely that you'll go for those kind of things as well.
I think if you structure your day where you think about your main meals, so your breakfast, lunch and dinner, you might have a mid-morning and mid-afternoon snack, and more often than not, we would suggest that mid-morning or mid-afternoon snack is something with protein in, so 20 to 30 grams of protein. So it could be like, the Arla protein yogurts are really good, or the pouches of yogurt. Like Jules says, your cottage cheese with some nuts and seeds, something like that. And then a piece of fruit. So you're getting some carbohydrate and you're getting some protein alongside that as well to keep your energy levels, but make, support recovery from a morning session, for example, or just support satiety, so you don't overeat later in the day or at lunch, or even reach for some rubbish basically as an alternative mid-morning.
Perfect.
Brilliant. Right. So I wanted to know, are any of the gadgets on the market that are coming out now and are marketed fantastically on Instagram and social media actually any use? So like things like Super Sapiens is obviously the big one in Ironman at the moment. Whoop bands, Aura rings that track HRV and calorie tracking. They all have, top athletes paid to market them and stuff like that. And they produce a whole ream of data. But is any of that data any good? And can we actually use it to inform better decisions on a day-to-day basis with our training and racing?
Right. Shall I take Super Sapiens, Jules, and you can take heart rate variability?
Okay, go on.
Okay, right. So Super Sapiens, I'm going to be diplomatic. I think is nonsense, to be honest. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Kit, when you said some top athletes are paid to market these things. I don't think they'd be using them otherwise, to be honest. So we do work with diabetics here at Liverpool, and type 1 diabetes patients in particular, who rely on the sensors that the Super Sapiens are based on, because they need to track their glucose, throughout the day to recognize when they're going to have or hyperglycemia or hypoglycemia, which is obviously they want to avoid that. And so, yeah, it's really important for those guys to be able to track that. And that's where the sensor that the Super Sapiens is based on is brilliant. In terms of informing your nutrition strategies with that sort of information, it's difficult. One of the limitations of the sensor is that it measures what we call interstitial glucose or sugar. And now interstitial is basically between the cells, between the tissues, and it's the fluid that surrounds all our tissues in the body. So it isn't a direct measure of blood glucose. And in fact, there's about a 10-minute delay in what you measure in the blood to then what you see in your interstitial glucose. So if, for example, and Super Sapiens are trying to push this, where you could see your glucose level on your Garmin, or how interesting would that be? Tell you when to take a gel or something during a race or training. Well, actually, the point at which it tells you you need to eat something is probably 10 minutes too late, because it's showing a low interstitial glucose and not a low blood glucose. So that's the major limitation really for me. And also, you're going to know if your glucose is low in your blood because you're going to feel shocking. So it goes back to this idea of like, just rely on how you feel. You don't need a gadget to tell you how you feel. And probably Jules will probably say that to a certain extent as well. I think the other thing with the Super Sapiens is it's interesting because, it can be used from an education perspective to a certain degree. So you could wear one, eat a full bag of Haribo and see your blood glucose go through the roof, and you're like, all right, I need to avoid that. Or you have some porridge and it's much slower release into the bloodstream from the gut. So you can start to immediately say, well, this type of carbohydrate, I get a spike, and this type of carbohydrate, I get a much, more measured response in glucose, which is what we're aiming for a lot of the time. Beyond that, it's difficult. And I think the other great example of that was the World Championships the other week in St. George. And they had some of the athletes wearing these sensors and measuring their glucose as they were going around. And, you know, even the commentators were sort of like, well, Eden's glucose is 180. Okay, so there's no context there, and that points, you know, you've got to understand what these numbers are meaning. You know, his glucose might have been 180 or 170. In reality, it's not really a difference. It's not important. It won't impact his performance in any way. So it's understanding what those numbers actually mean, I think, as well. For me, I don't think I wouldn't pay for them. I certainly wouldn't pay for one. Let's put it that way.
So the only concept I had thought of, or one of the concepts I had thought of using it, is in terms of testing race nutrition, and especially over 70.3 and Ironman, like you said about the glucose spike, would it have application in terms of, say, a high five gel gave you a quicker glucose spike than a Morton gel, so therefore one had better application over the distance? Or is it not able to measure it in that kind of level of detail where it has relevance?
Well, okay, so a high five and a Morton gel, let's assume they're very, very similar in terms of carb content, like 25 grams of carbs. The high five one might not be quite so many as Morton, but it's not so far off. You wouldn't be able to tell, you know, a 3 gram difference in carb content between the two gels, for example. I think there is a bit of application here if there is issues with, people have issues with bonking, for example, or, you know, they're taking on carbs, but they're not processing them. So that there's an issue maybe at the gut, and we just want to confirm that. So from potentially a diagnostic perspective for some issue like that, then yes. For the general use, and general use, day to day, I don't think it's so informative, or there's better things to spend your money on, I would say.
That's the thing, isn't it? Sexy marketing for triathletes that like gadgets.
Yeah. Heart rate variability, Jules, what's your view?
Yeah, so heart rate variability, Kit, I assume you're kind of talking in the context of kind of a daily reading as a measure of recovery or readiness to sort of train, which I think how most people kind of approach it. And I think for me, there's some place for it, particularly in age group athletes who are, you know, juggling their training alongside stressful life situations, work situations, family situations, you know, juggling all those different things. I think HRV can be useful to determine the additional stress of life on top of the stress of training. However, with any of these things, I think we need to avoid being completely reliant on a gadget telling us how we feel, and it can become a bit self-fulfilling in some ways. And I think that's when it becomes counterproductive. You know, if your HRV is low and it suggests a lighter day or a rest day, but you're feeling great, then, you know, you potentially kind of miss out on some opportunities where, you know, if you know in yourself that you feel good, you know, I think that sometimes you just need to listen to your body. But in terms of HRV, it is useful, I think. And yeah, as I said, I think it is useful to kind of measure in some way the additional stress on top of the training stress alone. It's probably the most effective way to do that.
I think the monitoring sleep as well. Did you mention that then, Jules? Sorry.
Oh no, you carry on.
No. Oh, the only other thing, yeah, with the Whoop, I mean, that monitors quite a few different things, but monitoring sleep's another one. You know, if you wake up in the morning, you're tired, and you've been up in the night, then surely you know that you didn't sleep very well. You don't need a monitor to tell you that you slept poorly. Whereas if you've gone to bed at 10 and woken up at 8 and not stirred, then you've had a great night's sleep. So again, I think it's one of those, isn't it? Too much information sometimes, or too much cloudy information that won't make that much of a difference overall, but you can get hung up on. Probably a little bit like some of the what's the word I'm looking for? The blood tests, Jules. What am I thinking of that Lucy Charles did? That's the word I'm looking for.
The food market.
Yeah, food allergy test. That's the word. Yeah. yeah, something like that. Again, it's potentially useful for if you feel like you're having issues, but I don't think it's something that you need to do just for the sake of it, because you'll probably find out you're allergic to or have an allergy or a 5% allergy to something, and therefore you entirely remove it from your diet. And I think that's dangerous. Whereas actually, and you almost create an intolerance sometimes with these things, because you remove it and then your body, your body's not exposed to it at all. And then you might go back to it at some point and it's just not going to deal with it very well. I'd say the gadget that is useful, if you've got the time to commit to it, or even periodically, is something like MyFitnessPal. Because yes, we would use that with athletes to track their diet initially, just to get a baseline, maybe a little bit of continued use of that, where we're trying to implement some small changes to start with. But for the athlete themselves, it just gives awareness, even if you track, because until you start looking exactly at what you're eating, sometimes you don't understand how many calories are in a food that you eat a lot of, for example, and you think, oh, why can't I lose any weight? And well, it's, I'm having 400 or 500 extra calories in the something I'm eating. A great example of that, I use that with the students here, is if you go to Starbucks, I always use the example of, I'm feeling rubbish today, go to Starbucks because there's one on campus, and you go, I'll have a coffee, I'll have a latte, and then I'll have, I'm buying a coffee, I'll have to buy a cake at the same time, and that's suddenly 800 calories that you just go, well, actually, yeah, and you don't realize until you track that or look at that, what additionally you're taking on, and things like that can quickly become a habit, and then it becomes an issue. So I think tracking your diet, not necessarily all the time, but periodically, is good, just to understand a little bit more about what you're putting into your body.
I can definitely relate to that. There's a lot of things that I did a bit of tracking and realized that actually how much peanut butter I eat and how many calories are in that, and the amount of it I just eat off the spoon, completely unregulated as well. But definitely how eye-opening that, not knowing or not reading the packets of stuff, like you say, a large latte or a slice of cake or whatever, actually how many calories are in things like that can be, open your eyes to it a little bit, for sure.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, I think the other kind of thing that is useful from a tracking perspective is for women to track their menstrual cycles using different apps, but the apps that I would tend to favor are the ones that don't preempt how you might be feeling, because one thing we do know is that everyone, women are all very different in terms of how they feel with their menstrual cycle on different days and things, and we don't yet know how it is best to kind of periodize nutrition or training around our menstrual cycle. The evidence just isn't there to kind of support that one way or the other just yet. So my feeling would be that it is important, and it's very helpful for women to track their menstrual cycle using apps like Clue or Flow, for instance, that don't provide any kind of feedback really in terms of you might feel tired today, or you might feel great today. I think it's just important that women can look for patterns themselves and report symptoms of how they might be feeling, whether that's pre-menopause, perimenopause, post-menopause as well, track these kind of things in terms of how they feel.
Which kind of leads on to my question. We listen to a lot of podcasts, and as you've quite rightly said already, there's not huge amounts of evidence in the physiological differences between men and women and how that should translate into training and to nutrition. But I think we've just, like, we living together, we mirror a lot of our training. And one of my questions is about fasted training. Is there a place for it, and is that place different for men and women when it's useful, etc., or should women be fueling more sessions and fasting less?
Go on, Jules.
So for me at the moment, the evidence isn't available yet to support women having a different approach to fasted training. That's not to say that they shouldn't, and I think from females that we work with, they they often report that they feel differently, maybe at different times of the month, or some sessions feel great, some sessions not so much. But I think there is a place for it in women, as Sam alluded to earlier. There's evidence that being a good fat burner is important for certainly for Ironman racing, and that's kind of the reason why people would do fasted training. It's to provide a stimulus that encourages the body to burn fat and over time become a better fat burner. So I think the thing that's important to remember is that the evidence that is out there that kind of would perhaps support that fasted training is less good for female athletes comes from studies that are done either in animals, in rodent studies, or in studies which have looked at clinical anorexia and things like that. And now it's just important to remember that that level of sort of fasting and that level of undernutrition is vastly different to the situation of 45 to 60 minutes or so fasted training before breakfast. So I think it's just important to bear in mind the context of these things, and even the small amount of evidence, if you like, that might be used to kind of support this or not. I think for women an individual approach is a good idea, and to work with their coach and perhaps a nutritionist to find the approach that works best for them. Sam, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
No, that was very diplomatic. That was good.
Yeah, brilliant. So we've got one here from one of our athletes, Tristan, and he cramps quite a lot, and despite having used kind of precision hydration and higher sodium content drinks. So he wanted to know if there was any recommendations around sweat rate cramping, preloading with sodium or other electrolytes, or anything around that, really.
So is that during Ironman 70.3?
Yeah, during 70.3, yeah.
So I think, well, if he's using the precision hydration already, then I would imagine he's followed their sort of preloading procedures. So for example, the pH 1500, they suggest, don't they, to use that. Yeah. Certainly in the evening before the race, and then you would drink some in the morning, a bottle of that the morning before the race, to make sure you're well topped up, and then during the bike leg ideally, and then maybe supplement with salt capsules, or the salt chews are also quite good during the run. I suppose understanding your sweat concentration is one part of that, which, and I don't know if Tristan's been to see precision hydration or just done it over the using the calculator, but so you also you need to understand the concentration of your sweat from a sodium perspective, but also your sweat rate, which you can determine at home, of course, just doing a simple test where you weigh yourself before and after 1 hour on the turbo or something at race pace or a typical session, and see how much weight you've lost, and also account for the fluid that you've taken on board during that session as well. So one thing is the concentration, and one thing is the volume of sweat, or the amount of sweat per hour that you need to then put those together to work out how much sodium you're likely losing during 4, 5, 6 hours, whatever it is that you're racing for, and then come up with a strategy to try and offset as much of that as you can. I mean, okay, you're never going to offset it 100%, and you don't need to aim to do that either, but it's just having that awareness. So I think the precision hydration testing is brilliant, because it does give you that concentration element to it. Well, that's only one half of the calculation ultimately. So it might be that the sweat rate is very high, and therefore you're losing a lot of sodium per hour, and that might lead to cramp later on in the race. I'd also say, based on my experience in Mallorca, I actually made sure I think I had 5 or 6 salt capsules on top of 2 bottles of pH 1500 during the bike, which I would never do I normally just have 2 bottles of pH 1500 during the bike leg when you're in more temperate environment. But I knew that it was going to be very hot that day, so I almost took on more, you know, made sure, especially on the bike, that I was in a good place from a intake of sodium and electrolyte perspective, because then when you get off the bike, you can go to salt tabs or salt capsules or the salt tube, should I say, through the run. But if you're already at a depleted state coming off the bike, then yeah, you're chasing your tail, which you're never gonna get back, really, and that also might be part of it. So it's just about coming up with a strategy that is going to work for you. But it's very individual, this, isn't it? Everyone sweats differently and at different concentrations.
And is there any risk in taking on too much sodium? So you say you took on 5 or 6 salt tabs on top of the 1500s. So does that increase risk of GI distress or anything, or is the worst case you essentially just pee out?
Yeah. So, well, yeah. Generally speaking, you'd have to go quite a lot to overdo it, I would say, especially if you're in a hot environment. So you will just pee a lot of it out. I always say that expensive piss, don't they?
Yeah.
pH 1500s and things like that. But it's useful. Potentially some GI issues, but unlikely, especially if you've practiced this again, then there's very little chance that you'll have GI issues. And again, you'd have to take on a lot. I probably have to do like 4 or 5 packets of pH 1500 over an Ironman bike leg to start to be in any sort of bother, or even it might not even touch the sides of that. So I don't know really. You'd have to go overboard, significantly overboard, I would say.
So then you're better off almost erring on the side of more salt than less salt.
Yeah, within reason. I mean, you've also got to think about, like Jules said right at the start, how you're carrying this, and depending on where you're putting it on your bike, it's something else that you've got to try and fit somewhere on your bike somehow. So there's that element to it as well. But yeah, so I think erring on the side of caution, particularly on the bike, is not a bad idea on an Ironman or a 70.3 bike leg, because it just sets up the run. And it's the same with the carbs, for example, when Jules said about taking on a few more on the bike than on the run, it just sets you up for that run, really.
Brilliant.
Obviously, we pulled this together today because we've got lots of athletes who have had fairly good, successful seasons in terms of racing, but huge questions come off the back of those races surrounding nutrition. So the last question from us, really, because we promote this to all athletes, is practice. But how often and how far out from a race day do you recommend that athletes should be practicing their specific race nutrition?
Want me to go, Jules?
Yeah, you carry on.
Yeah, I'd say race-specific nutrition 10 to 12 weeks out, because realistically that gives you, if you're saying you're doing a 1 big brick session a week and then maybe a long run, for example, that gives you 2 opportunities each week to practice and nail down your nutrition. And I think it's important to recognize that we're not just talking about race day nutrition here, but we talked about carb loading right at the start. You've got to practice that to come to terms in many ways with how many carbs that is. Also how you're going to feel as well. I think it can be a bit disconcerting sometimes to try and take on that many carbs, before a race, and you don't feel great. You feel a bit lethargic, naturally, but that's fine, because you'll wake up the next day and you'll be ready to go. But you just have to appreciate that you might feel a little bit like that. It's not to say you definitely will, but just understand how you react to that many carbs, and also the types of carbs as well. During a carb load, for example, we would focus on a lot more what we call high GI carbs, because we need them into the system, into the muscle, and then ready for the next meal or food, whatever it is, to keep that supply into the muscles regular during that 24-hour period before the race. Now, sometimes that's a lot of sugar, and again, not everyone reacts the same to that. So again, it's just about practicing that, and the more you can do that, then the more familiar you'll be with that. Also, 10 to 12 weeks out, if we take an Ironman, then you're probably going to do, 70.3 at least in the build up to that. So that's a perfect opportunity to practice that under race conditions, and then you can just extrapolate, particularly the race day nutrition, out for an Ironman, or refine what you've done if you're racing another 70.3. So I always think you should look at your A race for the season, or your first A race, and then work 10 to 12 weeks back from that and go, right, what are we going to, this is the time we need to start practicing that.
Perfect. I've got one final question because I didn't write this one down. It came from seeing an athlete at the weekend and I can't forget it. We have a lady who cannot eat oats and gets quite frustrated everywhere you go. It's oat bars and it's oat breakfasts. We've suggested sort of rice based, but is there any magic fix to this issue that you can give us some tips?
I wouldn't necessarily say a magic fix, but I think from the outset, without kind of any additional information, I think you're absolutely right that in terms of thinking about it from a sporting perspective, then rice is a really good kind of go-to alternative. You mentioned bars, so I don't know if you're talking kind of fueling on the bike, for instance, with that. But
frustrated that everything, whether it be a chia charge or everything seems to have like flapjacky based oats. So we, some of our athletes, in fact, one who raced in Ironman Italy used homemade rice cakes as part of their nutrition strategy, and got on really well with them. So there are kind of homemade alternatives that you can make in terms of rice cakes, rice bars, and there are kind of commercially available ones as well. Sam, anything to
the OTE duo bar is 40 grams of carbs, which is based on a rice cake that Team Sky came up with. And it's quite good. You can split it in half, so there's 220s when we're talking about fueling regularly during a bike, for example. But the homemade rice cakes are dead easy to make as well. Mix it up, put it in the fridge or freezer and chop them up and good to go basically. And you can come up with all sorts of things to put in them as well, make them savory or sweet, whatever you feel like. So.
Perfect. Thank
Brilliant.
You very much. Huge amounts of questions and loads of really good answers, so thank you.
No problem. I suppose we should finish and just say, if anyone wants any more information, then feel free to contact me or Jules, Instagram or
we've got your email addresses and things. You can always send people your way.
Yeah, your Total Endurance Nutrition across Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah,
that's right.
Give you guys a follow for tips and updates and stuff, and obviously the TTT athletes can get involved in what you're doing as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. All right, well, thank you very much for your time, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys.
cheers.
Bye.